Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. This is Walter Cronkite in our newsroom in New York City. There has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas, along with Governor Connolly of Texas. They've been taken to Parkland Hospital there, where their condition is as yet unknown. We have just learned, however, that Father Huber, one of the 2 priests called into the room, has administered the last sacrament of the church to President Kennedy. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Welcome to George's World, I guess you could call it. I've never identified it as such at the beginning of a podcast, but that's kind of what it is. And this is an important part of it, and I've got a real thrill for me today. I'm interviewing Gerald Posner, an award-winning investigative reporter, author, a journalist, really, is the way that I look at him. And I followed this man's career for many years. He's done some great work, and I want to read the little bio here to get started. And it reads that Gerald Posner, as I mentioned, he's an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and an attorney. The Los Angeles Times dubs him a classic-style investigative journalist, which, man, that's where it's at as far as I'm concerned. His work is painstakingly honest journalism, concluded the Washington Post. The New York Times lauded his exhaustive research techniques. The Boston Globe talks of Posner's thorough and hard-edged investigations, a meticulous and serious researcher, according to the New York Daily News. Now, his books, his first one was called Mengele. It was a 1986 biography of the Nazi angel of death, Josef Mengele. It was the result of a pro bono lawsuit Posner brought on behalf of surviving twins from Auschwitz, and that started his book writing. Since then, he's written 10 other books, from the Pulitzer Prize finalist Case Closed, which we're going to be talking about today, to bestsellers on political assassinations, organized crime, national politics, 9/11, and terrorism. His books, God's Bankers, now that was on Catholic Church finances, that result of 9 years of research. That's the kind of work this guy does, folks. And his new book's due out soon, and it's entitled Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. Well, that's kind of a long bio, but Gerald, if you hadn't done so many great things in your life, I wouldn't have such a long bio to read. Welcome to a podcast by George.
George, it's great to be with you. As a matter of fact, I know you cover all of the subjects that I'm interested in, and I don't get to all of them because books do take a long time, as you said, but it's great to be with you.
Well, it's well worth it, and the book that we're going to talk about today is one of my most prized possessions. I'm going to hold it up here. This is Case Closed. This is the book that came out in the early 90s, I believe, and this is your go-to source for everyone when it comes to the Kennedy assassination. And I want to get to that because we just passed the November 22nd holiday again. There's been a little bit of news around the internet, and there always is, on the Kennedy assassination that Gerald can talk about. But I kind of wanted to come at you from right field here to start with a little bit and talk about something that's been all over the news. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, God, I know one guy that could probably get to the bottom of this if he chose to. And I want to ask you about that, and it's this Jeffrey Epstein thing. Have you taken a look at that? Do you have any initial comment on that case?
You know, I haven't taken a look at it yet because I've been finishing up the pharma book, and which turned out to be a bigger project than even I had envisioned. I knew it'd be a large project. And so I haven't had the chance to look at Epstein yet. And here's why I think it's critical this is my approach. I'm the perfect type of reporter journalist to look at Epstein or another case because I don't have my mind made up. Therefore, I'm going in, and based upon what the evidence shows me, maybe I'll conclude that there was foul play and he was murdered. Maybe I'll conclude it was just a suicide. But if you don't already have your mind made up, a lot of people seem to say they already know what happened. They have a hunch about what happened. But if you really go in there and just follow the evidence, I love the idea of let the evidence take you where it will. That's what happened on the JFK book. I never expected to be an Oswald alone book, but it turned out to be that once I started researching. So on Epstein, I'm open and I'm willing to take a look at it. Both possibilities seem to me as though they could be credible.
Well, turning to JFK, and I hope you do, because that's gonna be my go-to authority on that probably. And as I mentioned, you did the Case Closed book, and it's where I go all the time. It's an easy book to read. God, you're a great writer. I mean, this isn't dry research stuff. The guy's a great writer of nonfiction, so it's an easy read, and it's laid out well. And you got the the notes and the bibliography and the index so that you can quickly find something, and it's just a great source. And just FYI, the thing that I saw on here on the internet just recently on a Lee Camp YouTube was the Mary Meyer incident is kind of raising its head again. People are talking about that. So I went to, I think, page 474 in your book. Yep, there's Mary. So, and that's my source. Has anything changed on your perspective about her possible involvement or knowledge about the Kennedy assassination?
No, and George, here's what's interesting is things go in ebbs and flow in the Kennedy assassination. So some things that seem out of favor as theories get revived for some reason. And she's such an interesting case. I have that index at the end called 103 non-mysterious deaths. So Jim Marrs in his book Crossfire, which I call the kitchen sink of conspiracy theories, sort of every possible conspiracy theory thrown in there, list all of these people, 103 people supposedly murdered by some mysterious and unknown reasons after the assassination because they knew something, they were going to disclose it, blow the lid off the case, and the secret conspiracy had to keep them under wraps. Mary Myers is one of them. She was an artist, a painter who went for a walk in October of '64 in Washington, D.C. in Georgetown, and she gets shot on this towpath. Now, doesn't seem at that moment very interesting, but it becomes interesting 12 years later in 1976 when the National Enquirer runs the story that she might have been a mistress of JFK, one of his many mistresses at the time. And although some people dismissed it, I think that's true based on her own diaries and other accounts of people that knew her. Now, this is where the Kennedy assassination is what I call the perfect storm in a dozen different instances. And it is here because her husband works for the CIA, and the family's friends were around the CIA. And as the CIA theories grew that maybe the CIA was behind the assassination of Kennedy, they somehow linked her death to Kennedy. It was Jim Marrs who first put her in. This is the interesting part of it. So what did she know a year after the assassination that caused some secret group of plotters to kill her? The answer is nothing, because her diaries, which do talk about her affair with the president, don't disclose anything. She never at any point says, and by the way, if I could only tell someone what I knew about what happened in Dallas, or I need to talk to somebody. There's nothing about this. Never had a conversation with anybody, never wrote a letter, never had a telephone call with a friend that said, oh my, there's something to disclose. So her death, yes, shot the person who was charged with her murder, acquitted at the trial. And I see how the conspiracy theorists put her in, but there's not a shred of evidence to indicate that she had any bit of knowledge or any link to knowing anything about the case.
Well said, as always, and that's kind of the way that the research indicated. The one thing that was, and these people in Washington are all connected. She's related, I think, to Ben Bradley or something, the editor of the Washington Post. And
I remember that as vaguely. I think that's right. And her husband was in operations. And so, it's what I say. Here's a case, George, and you understand this so well, that not only gives us little footnotes like this, which can send you down the rabbit's path for a month, but ends up with an assassin who had defected to the Soviet Union and then was trying to get to Cuba, who's killed 2 days after he's arrested by a nightclub owner with possible ties to the mafia. You couldn't make this up in a movie if you were looking at it. And no wonder so many people who don't study the case or look at it are suspicious, because on its surface, you say, it can't all be coincidence. But in fact, when you get into the facts, as you know, it's an amazing story, but it's not a conspiracy.
That'd make a great movie. Unfortunately, Oliver Stone missed it. He didn't cover hardly any of that in this complete fabrication.
Oh.
Well, we could get to that. I kind of wanted to start with kind of an unusual, kind of a big picture approach to this, and to get your thoughts on this. I've told people on this podcast before, for people our age, and Gerald and I are almost exactly the same age, in this country, if you believe that the CIA or the FBI either was involved in killing the president of the United States or the vice president, Lyndon Johnson, or something like that, or maybe that they were a cover-up agency, your entire perspective of America, of the world, has to be forever changed in the way that you look at this country and the way that you look at politics and all that. So you can't overestimate how significant the John F. Kennedy assassination was in this country and the world. Do you look at it that way?
Absolutely. I think you're so right. I think it's the mother lode in that sense of conspiracy theories. And what it does, it's the start of the loss of faith in America for many people, because you have the Kennedy assassination, and then for a while in the beginning, you don't have the growth immediately of the conspiracy theories that said, oh, it's the CIA or the government was behind it. Then you have Watergate, and you have Vietnam, and you have Iran-Contra, general loss of faith in government. And as the Oliver Stone and those theories, it says it's really a secret part of our own intelligence agencies who killed the president. If you embrace that, if you believe that's what happened, if that's what I had found when I had researched the book, you'd have a fundamental loss in the institutions that have helped to make this country so great. And I do think that it has shaken faith for many people and caused them to lose a dose of patriotism about America, no doubt about it.
Give you my little thumbnail sketch. I bet you've heard maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of these little vignettes, but I'm a third grader sitting in a classroom in November 22nd, 1963. One of the teachers is in the lounge smoking like they always do, listening to a transistor radio. The news bulletins came across that radio. She came down the hall crying, screeching with sorrow. What the hell's going on? That doesn't happen in class very often. Well, the president had been shot. They let us out. I can remember the weather of the day perfectly. You got to remember now, I was a third grader, and I'm 64 years old today, and man, I remember it like it was yesterday. Here in Des Moines, Iowa, it was rainy and it was cold. It wasn't snowing, it wasn't sleeting, it was just rainy. We lived on a dirt road. That's how long ago this was, and that meant the school bus couldn't go down it. The road was mud, and I had to walk about a mile, one of those stories that kids have in the mud, to get home after they let school out early. My mom met us at the kitchen door and was, beside herself with grief, which is very interesting. My mom was kind of one mindset. She was somebody that loved Elvis and loved the media and that type of thing, and she was extremely grief-stricken by it. My father was kind of a hard-knuckle, redneck truck driver that was out on the road that found out about it when he stopped at a roadside cafe. And he wasn't nearly as shaken by it as my mother was, which kind of surprised me. But it affected me deeply. And just to fast forward my story a little bit, so I followed this, read some of the research and a lot of the National Enquirer stuff, it seems like, up until the House Select Committee hearings in 1976 or whenever that was. And there was a class at Drake University that I graduated from. And it was on the Kennedy assassination. And if you ever encountered this guy, and if this name rings a bell, tell me, Gerald. I don't know if it does, but there was a professor there in the history department that really was knowledgeable. He was kind of more than just a hobbyist when it came to the Kennedy assassination. This guy was an authority. His name was Charles Nelson, and he was a history professor at Drake University, and he taught this class. And I mean, people were sitting in the hall to take it at the time. And as you know, that the House committee came out with kind of an interesting finding, and it's since kind of changed. Tell us about that.
Yeah, George, it's so interesting because I was in fourth grade at that time in San Francisco, where I grew up, in a Catholic school, Sisters of Charity. I was raised Catholic, and so here's the first Catholic president those nuns were crying. And you want to, as a fourth grader, see nuns who are normally so tough. They're the ones who used to, grab us by the ear if we were talking and pull us across the room. To see nuns crying was a remarkable thing. And then our parents as well. It had an impact on those of us as kids. You're absolutely right. And although we couldn't understand the gravity of it, remembered when you were watching the House Select Committee, I was in law school out in San Francisco, and I followed it closely. They did some amazing work. They sort of settled so many of the canards and false information that had grown up in the 15 years between, or the 14 years between the Warren Commission and their report. And then it all went south when at the very end, they found what they thought was an audio tape that had been made on a dictaphone that was sitting on a motorcycle, one of the Dallas policemen in the motorcade. And someone had the clever idea, well, if that Dallas policeman on the motorcycle was near the car when the shots took place, maybe we'll hear the sound of the bullets and we can save 3 or 4. And you listen to that audio tape, and George, if you heard it, what do you hear?
Yeah, it's
you hear a bell ringing. You don't hear any shots. So they got these sound experts, quote unquote. They were sound experts who came in and they said, well, it's true. You don't hear anything, but you see these spikes here. Those are really subsonic spikes. That is the sound of bullets. You just don't hear it. And they happened 4 times just around the point of the assassination. Therefore, it's a conspiracy. They're running out of money. They're running out of time. That's their conclusion. That later gets debunked by the National Academy of Sciences and a whole bunch of people. And it's a shame because all the public remembers is the headline, 95% probability of conspiracy in the JFK assassination. And they forget the other 2 years of work that the House Select Committee had done that was fantastic.
I mean, that was a big part of my past, and it's a part of everyday life. Honest to God, last night I'm at a political function, standing next to a woman from Dallas, Texas. We were talking about Dallas, and I told her, I said, I'm going to do this interview tomorrow, but I can't get away from. To me, Dallas, it's kind of like it's unfortunately thinking about Germany and the Nazis. I mean, you shouldn't think of Germany that way. I've been there. My God, it's a beautiful country with beautiful people. What a wonder. You can't get away from thinking about Nazis every time somebody mentions Germany. Oh, I'm talking about Dallas. Well, we end up talking about, the Kennedy assassination. I love talking to you. Is it true that Kennedy predicted his own death kind of in Fort Worth? Somebody quoted him as saying that all somebody had to do was shoot the president from a tall building or something like that right before he went to Dallas?
Yeah, I mean, he did say it in a general sense. It's almost that prophetic. You listen to Martin Luther King, right, in the church the night before he's assassinated. It's saying that he's been in the mountaintop. He doesn't fear any man. He doesn't care what happens. It's sort of that moment. And then in light of when he's killed, it takes on such meaning. Kennedy's comment would have been, about security not taken as very important. It would have been a footnote story, except for the fact that he's killed in Dallas. And even though he knew that, and the Secret Service understood that, it's remarkable, George, that we lived at a time in 1963 when they didn't sweep those buildings. They didn't look for that. They published the motorcade route, as you know, in the paper twice before Kennedy arrived. They showed exactly what turns he was taking. Why? Not to put him in any danger, but to bring people out to the street so you would know where you went. It helped, of course, Oswald decide, oh my God, he's turning right in front of the place where I work. Gave him the perfect bird's eye sniper's nest view. So it was a very different time in terms of security, unfortunately, and things changed radically afterwards.
Yeah. And I'm talking to this woman, and she's no dummy. I mean, this woman's smart. She's informed. She's politically aware, obviously. We're at this function. She turns to me and she says, I've always believed that Oswald didn't do it. And I looked at her and I said, well, and Gerald, now you can correct me here, but this is the way I explained it to her. I said, well, here's this guy that was seen in the window, and a gun barrel was seen by some people. A description was sent out by Dallas police that matched him. He was the only guy that left the Texas School Book Depository after the shooting. He hurried home, changed clothes, got a gun, which he used to kill a Dallas police officer when he was stopped because he matched the description. He still had the gun on him when they got him in the theater, when they arrested him. They brought him into the police station, and he lied from one end to the other, including whether he owned a rifle, which was recovered from the Texas School Book Depository, just a short walk from where the sniper's nest was. It had a palm print on it that matched his. I mean, I told her, I said, you can believe that other people were involved maybe, and you can explain to me how you think that. But I got to tell you, I think Oswald was involved in the shooting. I think he was up there popping off shots, folks.
Yeah, it's very interesting, George, because you just laid out the evidence, and most people don't realize what the evidence is. But, here's the point that I always make about the case. There are two things. One is, some people think Oswald's a complete patsy, right? The idea that he's just set up and doesn't even know what's happening. Well, if that was the case, then he's clearly in flight after the assassination, as you said, goes home, gets his pistol, shoots a Dallas policeman. He's fleeing because he's part of something. Now, I also think the evidence is overwhelming in terms of the people, the eyewitnesses and the palm prints, the fingerprints, that he's the shooter. Now, the tougher question is, if he's the shooter, there's nobody else shooting at Dealey Plaza. Is he part of a plot? Is he doing it for the mob or the CIA or for Castro, the Soviets, or somebody else? Or is he doing it for himself? That's always the most difficult part to answer. And that's why, as you know, the first third of my book is really a biography of Oswald. That he's the overlooked character. And once you get to understand Oswald and what an unusual and he's 23 years old, just turned 24. When you realize that nobody could work with him or depend on him because he was a one-off fellow who was looking to put himself into the history books, thought he was going to do it by killing a right-wing sort of army general in Texas who was running for the governorship, Edwin Walker. And when he fails to do that, Kennedy's a gift in his sights. But the real question is this. People confuse this. They say to me, so you don't think there were any conspiracies against Kennedy? I say, no, that's not true. I think there were conspiracies against Jack Kennedy, just like there are probably conspiracies against any sitting president. If Barack Obama, Donald Trump, any other president was assassinated, you'd immediately, once you knew who the assassin was, determine what were they? Were they tied to a radical Islamic group? Were they anti-abortion people? Were they people who were on the far left? You'd want to know. There were always plotters talking about getting the president. The mob hated Kennedy, no doubt. Some of the CIA were mad at him. Castro knew that the Kennedys were trying to kill him. Khrushchev and the Soviets had been embarrassed in the missile crisis in 1962. Plenty of people could have wanted him dead. My point in the book is you need to tie Oswald into one of those plots in order to get a conspiracy. And in absence of that evidence, then Oswald beat the conspirators to Kennedy. He got there for his own warped reasons before any of them did.
And you mentioned something that I think is critical, and I will bring this up oftentimes when I'm talking to Edwin Walker, that general. Not only is it proof that he was an assassin, trying to take somebody out, but it was kind of plotless. Also, this is a guy that was operating entirely on his own. I think he went there on foot. He ran home and hid the gun on the way or something like that. The only person that he told about it or that even knew about what he'd done was his Russian wife. It not only proves that he's out there shooting at people, but that he's not involved with anybody. I mean, it just was a plotless effort that, unfortunately, missed him. Yeah.
And missed him. And a lot of people don't even know about Edwin Walker. But what's interesting about that is that, there's something else critical. When Oswald, in the summer of 1963, just months before the assassination, he's moved to New Orleans, in part because his wife, the young Russian Marina, is afraid he's going to try to kill Walker again. So she has some family down there. So they move down. He has an uncle down there. They moved down to where Oswald was born. He's trying to get sort of volunteers for his new revolution down in Cuba. He doesn't get a single one. He's on the corners of New Orleans in the sweltering heat of 1963. He leaves for Mexico City on September the 25th because he's decided he's going to go to Cuba and then bring Marina down afterwards. And it's on that night when he's on a bus on the way to Mexico City that the White House announces for the first time that Kennedy's going to visit Dallas. He's going to visit Texas. No one knows before September 25th about that visit. So any plot against the president has to form from that time and on. And where's Oswald? For the next 10 days, he's in Mexico City, getting thrown out of the Soviet and Cuban embassies. They won't give him a visa. They won't send him down. He has a fight with one of them. He slams his pistol on the table. They think he's off kilter. He comes back to Dallas in early October, and he's living in a boarding house with other people. His wife separated from him, living with a friend outside of Dallas. Now, this is the period, George, in which if there's going to be a plot to bring Oswald into it, somebody has to contact him. You can't do it through telepathy. Somebody has to show up at his door. They have to make a telephone call. They have to reach out to him. They have to meet him at work. And that's the period in which there's not a shred of evidence that Oswald's doing anything other than his own unusual world. That's Lee Harvey Oswald's world of revolution. No tie to a conspiracy, no plotters, until he finds out Kennedy's coming in front of where he works.
Lee Harvey's world of revolution. And your book, of course, is brilliant in its depiction of Lee Harvey Oswald. My God, you get crawl inside of this guy's brain. It's great, telling his past, his growing up, self-educated, couldn't get along with anybody, a complete outsider always. But here's the thing I think that's really critical that you bring out. Was he a nut? Yeah, he was a nut. He was kind of crazy like a fox in this respect. You see those crazy actions that you just mentioned. Why would a guy do something like that? Well, he was a big reader of revolution nonfiction all over the world. I mean, out of the public libraries. He was hopeful that a revolution would be ignited by an act like this. It's happened before, certain circumstances, and he's not alone in this crazy idea. There's a guy named Charlie Manson that has been blamed with thinking the same type of thing, that if I could just get her rolling, even if they arrest me, I'll be sprung and I'll be the new leader. Do you think that was in his mind?
Yeah, I do think it was in his mind. I don't even think that he necessarily thought of himself as a leader, but he clearly thought that he was smarter than other people, and they didn't realize that. He always felt as though he was clever and understood more than others did, and didn't understand why people didn't look up to him. And here was somebody who, remember, we have an unusual thing. He was a truant at a school in New York City. They sent him over to a psychiatrist who interviewed him, suggested he got professional help, and at 15 was saying that he had sociopathic and violent tendencies that had to be dealt with, and his mother just took him out of New York and they never went back. This is a kid who, when he joined the Marines because he thought he followed his brother, which straightened out his life, they thought he was gay. They threw him in the shower. They called him Mrs. Oswald. They made fun of him. He left the Marines bitter. He goes and defects to the Soviet Union thinking he's going to be welcomed as a hero. They think there's something off kilter with him and they want to kick him out. He tries to kill himself. They save him, although he slit his wrist, and they move him out to Minsk where he marries Marina. He hates the Soviet Union when he's done. He goes through a 2-year process to repatriate to the U.S. And when he comes back here again, nobody thinks he's anybody. Nobody listens to his politics. He fails in killing Walker. He tries to go to Cuba. He can't even get down there. So him killing Kennedy is his moment of standing up and saying to all those people, to the Marines who threw him in the shower, to the people in the Soviet Union who kicked him out, to the Russian emigres in Dallas who thought he wasn't that bright, saying, you think I wasn't? I just changed history with one bullet. And he did. And Lee Harvey Oswald, we're still talking about him today. He'd be ecstatic over the fact that he's remembered and all the rest of those people who treated him so badly are long forgotten.
My God, I could literally talk for hours, but Gerald's a busy man, as we mentioned at the beginning, so we can't keep him. But we started off talking a little bit about this Jeffrey Epstein thing, and I want to not talk about him. But the point is, there was a new batch of documents that were released recently, and I thought, well, okay, if there's anything to this, any bombshells in there, I'm going to be hearing from Gerald Posner. And I didn't hear too much from you. It probably wasn't much to this, and what people were interested in, it's kind of like Epstein in a certain respect. When he went to that, they're saying, oh boy, that Mexico embassy thing, that visit down there with the Russians, the cameras were off. There were no photos. Oddly enough, why would that be? That points to a conspiracy. Epstein in his jail cell, no, the cameras were off. I don't know. So what do you make of all that?
Well, I tell you, I've always said in case closed, although I come to the conclusion that Oswald did it alone, I don't agree with the Warren Commission. I mean, I think they did a good job considering how little time they had. And a year was a small amount of time and the public pressure they were under, but they got the sequence of shots wrong, which was a big difference. They gave Oswald too little time. They didn't investigate Jack Ruby's mob connections aggressively enough, although there's nothing there. They should have looked at them more. They sealed too many documents. And one of the things that happened to them, there was a cover-up by the CIA and by the FBI. And people found evidence of that in the years after the assassination, thought it meant a cover-up of a murder. It didn't. It was the cover-up of their own bureaucratic reputations. Cover your ass. The CIA was petrified that the Warren Commission would find out that it was in a partnership with the mafia to kill Fidel Castro. So it hid all that information that it had. And Oswald being in Mexico City was a terrible thing for them because it was in Mexico City where it was a spy's nest and they were spying on the Russians and Cubans all the time. So I've always had doubts, and many people have who have studied the case, that they did not, meaning the CIA and our embassy, have more in terms of pictures of Oswald going into the Russians, possibly even a video recording or an informant inside the embassy. Whatever they had, they never turned over, and maybe it's still inside the files. It'll be embarrassing to the CIA. And why, when Oswald comes back into the U.S., don't they alert the FBI that this guy is trying to get to Cuba and is a revolutionary danger? The FBI's cover-up was to destroy a note from Oswald that he had left for a local agent in Dallas. They were afraid that somebody would point a finger at J. Edgar Hoover and say, you know what? You guys had a case open on him. You knew he came back from Russia, and you didn't take any action when he was sitting in and working in a spot where the motorcade of the president was going to go right in front of it. So both of those groups, bureau and agency, at protecting themselves, did a disservice to history and the truth. By covering up items and evidence, they led people to believe they were covering up a murder.
Did you see anything in that document release that changed your opinion on anything?
The only thing it did was worsen my opinion on the way the CIA handled the investigation after the assassination. If I was redoing Case Closed today, the one change that I would make is to be harder on the CIA in my judgment post-assassination. I think that the evidence has emerged that they were opaque, dark, uncooperative, and really just viewed the Warren Commission. How do we avoid telling them too much about Mexico City? Not because they were working Oswald as an agent, but because they just wanted to protect all their assets and information.
Well, folks think this isn't important, and it's not a part of our everyday life up to the present day. Everybody's watching The Irishman. Have you seen The Irishman, Gerald?
I have. It's great to. Scorsese's a master at it, and it's wonderful to see all of some of my favorite actors come back up. I saw the reference to the Kennedy and the mob. I thought, okay, they threw in a little bit of a conspiracy there, but it's all right. It's allowed in filmmaking. And I wouldn't have even minded Oliver Stone. He's a great filmmaker. He's just a terrible historian. If he had done a piece of fiction, he did do a piece of fiction. The problem with him is he was passing it off as the truth. At least Scorsese passes off his films as entertainment.
What is it with that David Ferry guy? Why does he keep popping up all the time? He's in The Irishman. This guy's a minor non-issue, isn't he, or not?
No, he is, but he's perfect for film or television because he's colorful. I mean, you're talking about a guy who has flaming red hair in New Orleans and was a right winger. So he's perfectly made for Hollywood, no doubt about it.
I got to let you go on your way. I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it. This guy's a hero of mine, folks. This means a lot to me. And I just want to read the little closing here before we go out. It's Gerald Posner, and not only has he written these books, check out a couple of his most recent, The God's Bankers on the Catholic Church Finances. And he mentioned he was a Catholic schoolboy when Kennedy was shot. Took him 9 years to do that thing. And now I'm really looking forward to this book, that the impact of which is not going to be fully understood, I don't think, for a long time. And it's about pharma, and it's entitled Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. No truer words were ever spent. Gerald Posner. Yeah, thank you, man. Last words. If you got anything you want to say in closing.
The one thing is, I've just come out of 4 years on pharma, and people think they know the story of pharma because they read every day about something about big pharma and a recall on drugs or pricing or drugs or whatever else. I've gotten behind the scenes to tell a story, the history of the American pharmaceutical industry, and I think even when doctors and medical and pharma people read it, there's going to be some part of that book going to say, "Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that." There will be some eye openers. I think it'll be an interesting disclosure for quite a few people.
Guaranteed. Count on it. There's no doubt in my mind. Big moment for me. Thanks again. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, watching the podcast now that we're doing them on video, Skype, Zoom, whatever you want to call it. Today's guest, Gerald Posner. But for right now, that's another podcast by George.